Okay, thank you, everybody. Welcome back to this, the last session of the speaking part of today's Taiwan update. After this, of course, we're going to watch a film tonight, which I encourage you to come along to. It's a very great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who is also an old friend, but he's also kind of my boss now. Dr. Craig Smith is the president of the Australasian Taiwanese Studies Association, which is a venerable and formal position, as you can tell on the one hand by his small beard and on the other by the way he's dressed. Craig is a very renowned scholar. He's at least educated in Canada, did his PhD at UBC, and then came to here, to this building, as a postdoctoral fellow. And he was a wonderful colleague and a wonderful postdoctoral fellow. And then, unfortunately, he must have done something terrible in a past life because he got a job at the University of Melbourne. He is now senior lecturer in the Department of Translation in the Asia Institute at the University of Melbourne, and is a scholar of literature and culture and intellectual history, I suppose, all of that. He wrote an extraordinary book that was published 3 years ago called Chinese Asianisms with Harvard University East Asia Press. And he's an active translator and has recently, very well published, recently written a couple of articles, at least a couple of articles or chapters on Zhang Wujun, Taiwanese writer, died in 1955 or something, roughly. Apart from being educated in Canada, did a master's degree in Jiayi before he did that. So he spent a lot of time in Taiwan, is very familiar with Taiwanese cultural scene and literature and so on, but as well as a much broader field of interest that he won't be talking about today, because he's going to be talking primarily today about how Taiwan has been framed in different narratives or something. I'll let Craig explain much better than I can, but I'll hand over to him now, and I'm sure you'll find it enjoyable and enlightening.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks a lot to Ben for inviting me in the CIW. It's great to come back and see a lot of old friends and to make a few new friends. It's always wonderful to be here. And thanks, of course, to Nancy and to Sharon for all their work in putting this together. So as Ben indicated, most of my work is about intellectual history. Although I started out in Taiwan, because I started my grad studies in Taiwan, I was looking at Taiwanese writers and Taiwanese translators, and somehow I jumped from that to writing a book about China-Japan intellectual relations. It is, of course, kind of a logical step. But these days I'm turning back towards Taiwan. I'm working on a book, wrong way. Oops. I don't know how to use technology, disclaimer. So I'm working on a book now related to translators, especially translators who are based in Taiwan, and looking at them as cultural intermediaries working between China and Japan and having to navigate a lot of difficult questions. But I didn't want to talk about that today. I wanted to talk about a more interesting narrative. And I wanted to use this as an excuse to look into some sources that I really wanted to play around with. But a lot of the theoretical underpinnings that kind of are important to my talk are still related to these ideas of translation and intellectual history. So I say, how is Taiwan framed by different cultural intermediaries? The theoretical side of it's not really that important. Cultural intermediaries was something that Pierre Bourdieu made popular, but you can get the idea. The way I'm using it is in a more general sense, as those people who play an important role in, especially in this case, in bringing Taiwan to the world, so in representing Taiwan, and the positions they have, sometimes the hegemony they have, and the way they frame Taiwan. And framing is something that was used a lot in news media, analysis of news media. So about 30 or 40 years ago, a guy called Irving Goffman started using it to understand how the news is presented to us. So you can imagine it, in the news, it's quite simple. When you turn on your TV, these days, there's actually a literal frame that tells you what to think about things. And in terms of literature and translation, we now use framing to think about how stories are presented, how we do footnoting, introductions, the covers, those kind of things. So the important thing is, for me, I like to think about that frame in a very literal sense and think about what's inside the frame that is presented to me. What's outside? What's the story that's not being told? What's the focus? What does it center on? What's pushed to its margins? Okay. So today I'm going to be looking at three different frames. The first one is what I call exotic Formosa. So the exoticizing, orientalizing of Formosa. The second one is more a little bit from a Chinese perspective, but not always. We're seeing Taiwan as an imperial agent. And then the last one is how Taiwanese people have been trying to represent Taiwan in the last few decades in particular. And that will connect well with the last two discussions we've had today. So let's jump right into it. So what I call exotic Formosa or early Orientalism, if we look at first European understandings of Taiwan, goes back to the mid-16th century. The Portuguese were sailing past the island. They called it Ilha Formosa, the beautiful island. Already we have a kind of exotic understanding of Taiwan. They never landed on Taiwan. They just drew these images from what they saw. Around the same time, the Japanese tried, well, they didn't really try. The emperor or the shogun said, let's make Taiwan into a vassal state called Takayamakoku. Nothing ever happened out of that, but it does play into something a little bit later. That's why I put it up on the screen. So, sorry, it looks like there's going to be a lot of history here, but I'm going to jump through the centuries quite quickly. Halfway through the presentation, we're going to be in last month, so it's going to move quickly. In the mid-17th century, of course, the Dutch colonized Taiwan, right? They colonized a small piece of Taiwan. And then we get the first writings about the island. And one of the most quoted of these is a man called Georgius Candidus, the first Dutch minister, missionary. He published this article in 1645. And he talked about a Taiwan that had no rule, no order, no laws. Looking back from now, we say, no, the indigenous people did have rule, they did have order, they did have laws, but maybe a missionary from Europe wouldn't have been able to understand that. Fortunately, people started disagreeing with this almost immediately. Well, 50 years later. 50 years later, we have a very interesting incident. George Salmanazar. Now, people in Taiwan studies might know this book quite well, but outside of Taiwan studies, I would imagine most of you have never heard of it. It's an amazing book about the first Formosan to arrive in England in the late 17th century. He actually wrote the book in Latin. George, of course, is not his original name, as you can guess. He converted to Christianity. In the book, he explains that his father employed a missionary who had gone to Japan to come to Formosa, come to the capital, and teach his son Latin. And George was a great student, learned a lot of Latin in 3 years, and then decided to run away. ran away with the missionary, and after a couple more years, ends up in London, writes this book in Latin, and hires a translator to publish it in English. So, really interesting story, right? The first Formosan in London arrives, criticizes Europeans' lack of knowledge on East Asia. He said Europeans have such obscure and various notions of Japan, especially of our island Formosa, that they can believe nothing for truth that has been said of it. So you're probably thinking, not much has changed in 300 years. We still need the Formosans to come here and tell us what's going on. All right. This book is really an amazing treasure trove of information. In the preface, Salmanazar goes into a geopolitical question that becomes big again in the 19th and 20th centuries. Does Formosa belong to China or Japan? He said there are some likewise that will tell you that the island of Formosa belongs to the Chan of China. But if so, why do the Chinese pay so great tribute to our governor? He actually relates all the arguments he had in London with political and religious elite about Formosa. So really interesting arguments, discussions. At the time, there were a few missionaries, British missionaries, who had been to China and come back, and he met them. And they would argue about his understanding of the island versus their understanding, which was kind of a Chinese understanding, but of course, late 17th century, things were a little more complicated as well. So, in these debates that he relates so clearly, he brings up a really interesting question. Is Formosa the same as Taiwan? This is why I keep using the word Formosa. And he argues that it's different. And I'm going to go with him. For now, we're going to accept this premise that Formosa is not the same as Taiwan. He said, this is him talking to one of the missionaries, I desired him to tell me by what name the Chinese called Formosa. He answered that he knew no other name for it but Formosa or Taiwan. But it's very plain, not only from what I, who should know best, assert, but also from a certain gentleman who has been in Taiwan, that it is an island somewhat remote and distinct from ours, and is now a colony belonging to the before-mentioned Dutch. It's getting a little bit strange, but 1704, the Dutch did not have a colony in Taiwan. They hadn't had a colony there for quite some time already. But in explaining this, he goes on to a detailed history of Formosa and the Chinese and Japanese attempts to gain control over this island. And he does say that the Chinese did control it for some time. It's a long history, a long, complicated history. And then he says, but now, because of some very convoluted religious and political issues, Formosa is more connected to Japan, but remains distinct from both. His discussions of Formosan uniqueness are fascinating. On matters of aesthetics, the Formosans prefer to pursue natural beauty in comparison with the Chinese and the Japanese. They are often nude or semi-nude. Men cover their privy parts with a plate tied about them made of brass, gold, or silver. And these would indicate class, of course. And we do have some images. So I'm going to show them. So trigger warning, there is some nudity over the next couple slides. And remember, these are what people in London were seeing in 1704, the very first images of indigenous Formosans. Maybe. There we go. So here you can see the plate that they used to cover their penises. You can see they had cloaks that they wore that were made from skins. And obviously the art is very, very strange. You should be thinking this is strange by now, right? Now, I had to look to see if we could find 17th century Japanese depictions to do a comparison, because the Japanese had traveled around a lot, of course, to Taiwan, and there were indeed Japanese drawings of Formosans in the 17th century. You can see a little bit of similarity. There's a cloak and a hat, but both very, very, very generic. Now there are so many pictures in this book, only looking at a couple of pictures. These are some of the women. There are many, many pictures of women. This woman on the right is very badass because in the description it says this is actually a cloak that she's taken off a bear. That's a bear skin that she is wearing. Things get stranger in exotic Formosa. So about 200 pages into this fascinating book, I should say about 2/3 of the book is about religion, theology, about his conversion to Christianity. We get to an amazing section on the capital city, Sternetsa. So this is where George Salmanazar grew up, where he learned Latin. You can see here the walls of Sternetsa are 20 cubits high. If you know how long a cubit is, I'm impressed. I had to look it up. It's 45 centimeters. So 20 by 45, that's 900. It means the walls are 9 meters high, 6 miles long. This section goes into how the houses were covered in gold. He talks a lot about the gold because the Dutch said there wasn't gold and silver in Taiwan. And for 17th century imperialists, gold and silver is really important. So the value of a potential colony is often related to its gold. And according to him, there's a lot of gold. But if you haven't guessed by now, this kind of exoticizing of Formosa was, of course, all made up. George Salmanazar, a few years after publishing a 400-page book about his travels, about the country, he admitted that he had never been there. And he had made everything up. So it's the ultimate in an orientalized, imagined Taiwan. That's why I say Formosa, at least in this instance, is very different from Taiwan. But there's so many lessons we can learn about how we understand Taiwan, how Taiwan's been understood through history and how it's understood today. I ended with the eating of raw meat and the eating of snakes. George was wined and dined when he was in London. He went to so many people's houses. And he relates that, he later related that all these people wanted him to feel at home. So they always served him raw meat. and he ate it. But it turned out that George was from the far-off country of France, where they did not eat raw meat. So his discussion of snakes, he has a long discussion about how they eat snakes and how amazing this is. And of course, a lot of the exotic imaginings of Taiwan today include the famous Snake Alley, which tourists often go to Taiwan and they go and eat some snake. And some of them are very surprised to know Taiwanese people don't really eat snake. I'm sure some do, but just like some Australians eat snake, it's relatively rare. So my point is to connect this framing of Taiwan. So the first frame we have of Taiwan, you might think it's far off in the ocean, in this imagined Taiwan, or maybe it has a small sliver of Taiwan in it. He did piece together a lot of information from real sources. So there is an overlap clearly there's an overlap in a lot of geographic information that he borrowed from other texts. But I argue that this represents an exotic, orientalized Taiwan, a sexualized land of splendor and naivety caught between empires. His book is perhaps the greatest book on an imagined Formosa, an island invented in and for the Christian West. So his eventual conversion to Christianity, he highlights the superiority of the Christian religion. So in a classic Orientalist text, he's created a power imbalance to make the British readers feel comfortable that their religion is superior to what he calls the religion of the heathens. He called himself a heathen. Now, writing what is clearly a book of lies, immoral, is it bad for one's career? For those of you who are familiar with popular international relations scholars, you might think, well, it's not necessarily so bad for your career. And it was true as well in the early 18th century. George Salmanazar ends up going on to a very successful career in theology. He had done such a good job in this book in showing that people should convert to Christianity, that he was well accepted. Okay, now we can move on to more contemporary understandings. I need trigger warnings for this one too. So, since the 17th century, Taiwan has been seen from some perspectives as a place of empire and imperialism, an agent from the Dutch through the Zheng Chenggong or Koxinga government, the Japanese, and now the Americans. Taiwan is seen as a place of danger from a Chinese perspective, but largely as an agent for large empires. After the Civil War, China has consistently argued that Taiwan is part of Chinese territory, and scholars have categorized their reasoning for this into history, nationalism, and geopolitics. And this framing is more about the framing from a geopolitical perspective. I think Deng Xiaoping summed it up quite nice. The issue with Taiwan is actually an issue with the United States. Both in the United States and in China, people use this word, an unsinkable aircraft carrier, to understand Taiwan as a representative of American military might. The same words were actually used for Japan in some circumstances, and I think originally for England in World War II. My mentor and Matt Galway's supervisor always reminded me, if you're looking up history in the 20th century, always look at what Mao said. It's always important. So I found this quote to be particularly fascinating and timely. Now, this is when Mao was speaking to the Palestine Liberation Organization in 1965. I think the Chinese, which you can find on Chinese websites and Chinese books now, I think it's translated from either the English or the Arabic, because the publication of this information was first published in the Palestine, actually, and then around the world shortly after. Imperialism fears the Chinese and Arab people. Israel and Taiwan are the basis for imperialism in Asia, and Palestine is the front gate of this great continent, while China is the rear gate. They are Americans. They created Israel to contest with you, and Formosa to contest with us. Thinking about this these days is quite complicated. It's a little bit difficult for a lot of people to make sense of Mao's argument here. But we have to accept it as one of the perspectives on Taiwan's position. So I see this framing of Taiwan as an occidentalized occupied Taiwan invented in and for China. The converse of that, of course, is an independent Taiwan supported by the United States as a free and democratic land. Occidentalism is as you can imagine, is the opposite of Orientalism. The idea of Occidentalism was popularized by a scholar called Chen Xiaomei, and her understanding of it is that the West in Chinese writings can be portrayed as an idealized or simple kind of West in order to support political writings for specific political purposes in China. Okay, so this framing, especially from a Chinese perspective, has, if you imagine Taiwan in the corner of the frame, the center of the frame is still on America. And the inverse of that is often discussed in the West as well. So we're already up to August. In August, former Prime Minister Paul Keating commented that Taiwan is simply Chinese real estate. This argument got a lot of people very upset, very upset. He was making an argument that Australia should avoid supporting American imperialist desire to separate it from China. He wants Australia to back out of any conflict between China and the US. And in order to do that, he wants to support Chinese claims on Taiwan. Nancy Pelosi, of course, is very famous. She was angry and indicated that Australians should support Taiwan because of shared values, especially because Taiwan is a democracy. She, once again, emphasized the ideas of freedom and democracy. So it's a different perspective on Taiwan again. Now, by this point, we're still talking about non-Taiwanese representations of Taiwan, right? And here we have two white Westerners arguing about the fate of Taiwan with, to be honest, little care for the actual Taiwanese people, other than that saying that Taiwan is a democracy, which is probably not the best reason to support Taiwan, but it is one of the reasons. The ubiquity of these geopolitical framings creates a contradiction for those who see themselves on the left. How does one support Taiwan without supporting either China or the United States? So the traditional caught between empires kind of issues. And I think Brian talked a little bit about this in his talk. Maybe not, maybe that was in his article. Now I'm getting confused with what he said today and what I've read that he wrote. So now we turn to recent Taiwanese narrations of Taiwan. How do Taiwanese people express Taiwan, especially to the world? I'm briefly going to go over three related expressions. So first, Taiwan in the 1980s comes out of this dark period, martial law. The White Terror, in which many Taiwanese intellectuals and even average people were arrested, imprisoned, sometimes killed. 228 incident, a terrible massacre of Taiwanese people in 1947 by the Kuomintang, the nationalists, when they arrived. Once you get into the 1980s and 1990s, getting out of that period, but also working towards transcending it. And in order to do that, there was a liberal and progressive spirit that really started to expand. Now, the critics will say, is this Taiwan or is it an elitist version of Taiwan? And I think there is some validity to that argument, but I still think we have to support ideas of Taiwan from Taiwan. So, in the transcending of this dark period, the Taiwan government and society has moved to identify and remember past injustices. In 2018, the Thai government established this Transitional Justice Commission to do just that. It's quite famous. A lot of statues that we once knew are no longer there. The TJC played an important role in that, and it's still going on today. Um, but it goes much beyond what the government's doing. So in terms of expressing Taiwan externally, this transcending of the past is one of the important narratives. So a couple of weeks ago, I was thinking about what I'm going to talk about for this presentation. And I was thinking about funding from Taiwan, okay? And I have relied on very generous funding from the Taiwanese government many times in my life. So I'm an agent, I'm a foreign agent. I have to declare this now every year. Do you guys have to do that here? Yeah, as well. Have to declare our monies from foreign governments, often 2 or 3 foreign governments. So trying to categorize, I thought about what I have received funding for. And generally, there's been 3 things. One is the transcending of this dark past. A couple of years ago, we had a book called Government Atrocities in Taiwan, Stories of Government Atrocity. And it was a book of translations, translating short stories related to the 228 incident and the White Terror that followed. So the horrible government atrocities. So now the government is kind of bringing this out to the world. The other things that we've had funding for, either me individually or working with my students, are queer studies, which usually does quite well. Queer Taiwan is well promoted. I brought my students in to get involved in some of the projects. And even the government has even funded mainland Chinese scholars to work on queer Taiwan subjects with me. So very generous in that regard. And the other one is indigenous issues. So for instance, last week, we had the National Museum of Taiwan Literature visiting Melbourne, and they brought with them Sakino Yatonglong, who is an amazing Taiwanese author. He gave a wonderful talk and song. And when we were discussing a couple months ago, what are we going to do? I was discussing with the museum. Really, the only things we discussed were either we do queer literature or we do indigenous literature. So clearly, these are the ways that Taiwan is presenting itself now to the world through these 3 themes. So one of them is indigeneity, as I said. The significance of indigenous peoples has changed dramatically. And now we see a lot in the arts, we see a lot of support for this, but there's also a real argument that how much of the money that the government is investing in promoting indigenous Taiwan abroad, how much of that actually gets back to indigenous peoples in Taiwan? That's a fair question, I think. I'm not saying they shouldn't be promoting, just accepting that there are valid criticisms. And then the other one is queer Taiwan. And queer Taiwan is now well promoted internationally. My students have had quite a few publications related to queer Taiwan supported by the Taiwanese government. And some of these students, like I said, they're not all from Taiwan, and they get supported to work on these projects. Some people have criticized Taiwan recently for what we call homo-nationalism, which I think is often a little bit unfair. We also see a kind of idea of a queer utopia in Taiwan, which is also sometimes a little bit unfair. Homo-nationalism is often used for when we talk about the United States, and queer scholars or queer elite often will support the United States in attacking foreign governments or religions, especially Islam. So when queer speakers or pro-queer speakers use queer ideas to attack Islam in public, or like the government of Iran, those are ideas of homo-nationalism. I don't think Taiwan is the same in that regard. I think it's mostly positive. But we can leave that question as a legitimate critique as well. In 2018, there was, of course, a referendum in which most Taiwanese people rejected the idea of same-sex marriage. The next year, the government decided to legalize same-sex marriage, And since then, I would say many people have embraced these queer positive policies, and things have been very, very positive in this regard in Taiwan. Sorry, that's a terrible picture of an amazing person. So, the Olympics ended what, 2 weeks ago? Something like that. 3 weeks? I have to admit, I don't watch the Olympics. I'm not a big fan of sports and nationalism, and the Olympics is a difficult time for me. But I like watching what happens with Taiwan. It's always an amazing story. And so these are stills from the Taiwanese stage in Paris during the Olympics. And this was an amazing moment when, this is Nymphia Wind here. I don't know if everyone's familiar with Nymphia Wind. Pardon me?
I'm a big fan. I've met them several times.
All right. So Nymphia Wind is perhaps the most famous drag queen in the world, at least one of them. The winner of the RuPaul drag competition earlier this year. She became an international sensation this year, and she was the star on this Taiwan stage to represent Taiwan internationally at the Olympics. And you know, how we represent countries at the Olympics is a great way of seeing how countries are creating their own narratives and how they're showing themselves to the world. So in this moment, which I have poorly captured, this is when Li Yuting, remember Li Yuting, the boxer, won the gold medal at the Olympics, and it was announced while Nymphia Wind was on stage. It's a lovely video to watch. Li Yuting, of course, was accused of what do we call these issues? Gender issues. I don't really want to get into these ideas because I know it's very sensitive for some people, and for somebody who doesn't understand sports, I don't really get it all. But when she won the gold medal, Nymphia Wind broke down and started crying on stage. They put it up on the screen behind her. She started crying, and then she shouted out to the crowd, "Somebody give me a Taiwan flag." And she picked up, the Taiwan flag is not allowed at the Olympics. And she said, "I don't care, they can kill me." And she waved it on the stage. It was quite an amazing moment. And then she pulled up a bunch of Taiwanese politicians and the other drag queens, and they got into a song and dance, singing a popular Amis indigenous song together. So it's really an interesting culmination of how Taiwan is framing itself to the world today. It was really, really an amazing video. Now, very briefly in conclusion, I don't have a great conclusion for this, but obviously there are very many different perspectives on Taiwan, and there are different ways of framing Taiwan. And I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I realize we use different frames all the time, and some frames are necessary for different occasions. But some frames have more validity than others. And as cultural intermediaries, which maybe more than half of this room might be cultural intermediaries working with Taiwan and or China, we have to be aware of these frames in our own work. Orientalist and Occidentalist imaginings of Taiwan continue to persist, but we should also support the people of Taiwan in deciding how to frame their home while still making sure to continue asking what lies outside of these frames that are presented to us. I will stop with that.
Thank you, Craig. That was a characteristically Olympian performance. I mean, for those of you not in Taiwan studies, just to indicate that Craig's smooth and easy manner and speech belies watches of research. And there's a lot underneath that he has brought together in a really superb way. So thank you very much, Craig. I'm not surprised